I'm here, Victoria is here, and the work that the charity does is trying to help that, and would be good that we had more resources, and that is what we're planning to do, having more resources available for when someone gets diagnosed, to have the available pack, the resources available to to tell their family members. So basically, it's on the first slide, I just mentioned why this presentation matters, because it's just giving you the background of how we should be approaching these conversations. And we know that many people are unsure how to talk to family about genetic conditions, not just about hemochromatosis, but overall about genetic conditions, because once you hear this word genetic or inherited, they know automatically that might be a lifelong condition because you were born with these genetic mutations. So that is why there is this difficulty in approaching these conversations. And basically, throughout this presentation, I'll be giving a bit of a few bits and tips in terms of language, how to be more confident, and the practical steps to follow to get these conversations going. And as Neil mentioned, initially this is a part of a wider national project, specifically in England to support family members, but overall families. So it's important when they start having this conversation, it's important that they on themselves, they actually understand well what genetic hemochromatosis is. And that is why we are here to help knowing and empowering people to understand the genetic condition. So because they're going to start these conversations with other family members, it is quite natural that they will be asking lots of questions, or the extreme of things they might actually just ignore, might not be interested. But most people will be interested in knowing more about hemochromatosis. So before you start having these conversations, you need to make sure that actually you really understand what genetic hemochromatosis is. Of course, you don't really need to go into the inner bits of hemochromatosis, the pathophysiology of hemochromatosis in a more medicalized terms. But actually, it's important to know the understanding the condition, and knowing the symptoms, because you're going to need to mention these symptoms, and actually mention that this is very common in people of Northern European ancestry. So it does affect mostly Northern European countries. We know that is the most common genetic condition. So by just saying that this is a genetic condition, which is very common indeed, actually that they might feel that actually this was going to happen to some degree, because it's so common in UK, for example, and in Ireland as well. In Northern Ireland, we know very, very prevalent indeed. So now, why family matters? Because it's a genetic condition, is an inherited condition. So we know that other family members might be affected, or might be just carriers of hemochromatosis. So it's important that they understand the inheritance patterns, because that is going to empower them to make more informed decisions. And also, as part of these informed decisions comes the early testing, which we know that it can prevent complications if we prompt early testing with family members, and explaining to their relatives all of these to start with. Actually, it helps already reduce some fear, reduce some confusion that they might have, and also reduce stigma. And I'll be talking about a bit more that later. So they really need to know how genetic hemochromatosis is inherited. We know, I mean, the most common type is HFE related hemochromatosis, which is type 1. But type 1, 2, and 3, they are all autosomal recessive conditions, which means that automatically you have to inherit two mutations, one from each parent. And type 4, which is much rarer, is only one mutation. So you just need to be carrier to actually have the condition. So it's important that they know this inheritance pattern to be able to discuss this with their family members, and explaining that they might be carriers, they might be completely negative, or they might actually be affected with hemochromatosis, and explaining that normally carriers don't normally develop iron overload as a result of that genetic mutation, but they can still pass that variant, that mutation to their children, even if they are carriers. And also in the case if they are affected, in the case of having two genetic mutations. Now, there are different genotypes, different combination of mutations, but for this conversation with family members, for initial conversation is not that relevant, okay? It's important that they understand, they digest all the information first, and then they decide whether or not they want to be tested, if they feel that is sensible for them to be tested. And then at a later conversation, you can start introducing that there are different genotypes, different combination of mutations. Some of them are more likely to cause health problems or even for them to develop iron overload. And some of other genotypes actually are known to be more benign and therefore they don't really cause any significant health problem. But of course, for the initial conversation, I think just knowing this or just mentioning this is just enough, because you don't want to be giving too much information, because actually this initial conversation, there is already quite a lot of information to go through. So you don't want to overload. It's important to digest all that information that is given to you by a family member. So in the case of first degree family members, so what do they need to know? So what they really need to know is that and this includes parents, children, and siblings, and normally children over the age of 18 that will be having these conversations, that they share 50% of genetic material, and therefore genetic testing will be recommended to determine their potential risk. Again, highlight the same aspect as before, that early detection equals prevention of iron overloads, and that a positive genetic test result does not necessarily mean that they will become unwell with the condition. Now, for the wider family, it's important to have these conversations as well. For example, second degree relatives. But we know that testing and even the clinical guidelines, I mean, if we go back to this slide about first degree, we know most of the guidelines do recommend genetic testing for first degree family members. I mean, let's say the British Society for Hematology, for example, used in the UK quite broadly, but even the international guidelines do highlight the need for first degree relatives to be genetically tested. In terms of the wider family, the guidelines don't really mention about this, okay? But we know that is not always recommended and is not always essential for a broader family member, for the broader family members to be tested. That is going to depend on the family structure. And of course, if they go to their GPs and have the blood tests, ferritin test and transferrin saturation test, suggesting that something might be wrong with their iron metabolism. And if they have, let's say, a second degree relative with genetic hemochromatosis, in that case, then they will need to be genetically tested, because we know this runs in families. So in that case, yes, that is going to be. But generally speaking, genetic testing is not offered or is not needed for the wider family, for second degree relatives. We know that the importance of testing increases when there are multiple family members with hemochromatosis. Let's say if it's just one family member, the risk of you also having genetic hemochromatosis is quite low. But if there are several members of the family with being diagnosed with hemochromatosis, then actually, even that you, despite not being first degree relative, then you should get tested in that circumstance, because we know that is more important because the risk is much higher in this specific scenario. And it's important to highlight again that there will be some emotional impact when you're talking to your family members about hemochromatosis and about the diagnosis. And the most common reactions, and we do hear this quite often on a helpline, for example. I mean, for some, there is a sense of relief, okay, because actually someone of the family being diagnosed with hemochromatosis, then they start searching for it, and they actually find that they have been feeling fatigue, tiredness, with brain fog for many years, going to the doctors, back and forwards to the doctors, and no answer, no cause to their symptoms have been identified previously. And then they have a family member telling them, actually, I was diagnosed with hemochromatosis recently. And then they will put all in context. It's just a jigsaw. And they get themselves tested either through Hemochromatosis UK or other private providers, or even they ask their GP as well, I'm coming to you for many years with all these symptoms. I never had my iron levels tested. I just had a family member diagnosed with hemochromatosis. Could this be genetic hemochromatosis? And then the GP actually might request a genetic test. And if that comes positive, in the majority of the situations, that is going to be of a huge relief to that specific individual, because actually that answers the unknown, the unknown answers they didn't know before. I mean, for many years, and we do hear this very, very, very frequently. Many people going to the doctors for, I had a case going to the doctor for 16 years, for example, okay? And just being diagnosed after 16 years because a family member was diagnosed. So actually, just giving a genetic diagnosis to this individual was very empowering and was just such a relief, because that individual knew, after having this conversation with us, that individual knew that there was treatment for it and that this could be well managed with the appropriate treatment. So that is why for some individuals, actually getting the diagnosis is going to feel some relief. Of course, there are other family members who might show significant worry because they know if a family member has been diagnosed with hemochromatosis, there's a chance that they might have it as well, and that might cause some worry, for some confusion, and for some who are not really interested, even despite in some cases having a first degree family member with hemochromatosis, they just don't really want to listen. There are different phases of acceptance, and the denial tends to be the first stage, and they're not interested. But after a few months or years, they actually start looking into it, and they might get themselves tested. But of course, we cannot change people's mind. What we can do is empower these individuals, to empower their family members to try to do the genetic test at least, or even to check their iron levels. Um, there is this sense that for some families, they might feel the guilty, the fear of blame, or even anxiety increasing because of this genetic risk in the family. Now, mostly important here is the reassurance. And I'll be talking about reassurance in a few more slides, because that's the most important thing, is once you know what hemochromatosis is, how it develops, how is it treated, you can actually offer that reassurance to your family members. And by just saying, well, actually, I've been diagnosed with this, this causes all this array of different symptoms. I really need to be treated because my iron level's very high indeed, for example. But just saying it's treatable, and actually it's well managed once you manage to deplete your iron stores. So just giving that empowering or just empowering those individuals by just giving that reassurance, it will make them think about the possibility of getting tested. And most important, when you're starting with these conversations, we know genetics are inherited, is definitely not caused by lifestyle. I mean, for some individuals, there might be some components of lifestyle which might interfere, let's say, with the rate of iron absorption, but we cannot change genetics. And there is a strong component to the genetic point here in terms of the risk of developing iron overload. So we should be avoiding the blame because we don't want to say, that actually you've developed iron overload because you didn't look after yourself, because you didn't exercise, because you were not careful with your alcohol intake. Of course, this we know based on science that all these factors might contribute to aggravate the iron absorption, okay, and increase the risk of liver disease, but you don't really need to mention that in these initial conversations. What you have to say is this is a genetic condition. Mostly, there is this genetic component risk that we cannot change. We were born with it. And that reframes the way people will be absorbing that information you're giving. Because otherwise, if you say that actually can also be caused to some extent by lifestyle, actually they might feel that you are blaming them by not looking after their body, by not looking after their health. And that is what we don't want in these conversations, because also every single family is different. That the dynamics in the families is going to be different, and therefore there is not there isn't we shouldn't be patronizing. There isn't a way where a one way of doing things right. Um, all all dynamics are different. We should be trying to prompt these conversations as they arise. Okay, and it's not very helpful if we give that sense of blaming in something. Wait, sorry. So how to start this conversation? So this is just a few examples from what we hear that people say, and actually we say, well, actually that's a good way of explaining things to your family members. Just explaining simply, it just means my body absorbs too much iron. So rather than using these medical terms, just saying this, and emphasize again how treatable hemochromatosis is, um, and share why you're telling them. For example, just using this script, I want you to have the chance to be tested early before any complications arise. So now is the right time. Um, and sometimes these conversations, people go away, and this is what people share with us. They go away thinking about it, but actually it's important to send a message or with these available resources. And most, I mean, now I would say we have lots of resources online on the Haemochromatosis UK website, to give them the chance after the conversation to go and do a bit of research themselves by just sharing, let's say, just some links into the website, because that is going to prompt them to research for themselves and see actually it's not all bad news, and they can go and do some genetic testing. Most importantly, like in every single conversation that we have, not just in genetics, when we are starting these conversations with family members, is trying to keep a calm, a factual, and supportive conversation, because that is the way that actually we will feel safe about ourselves, and we'll be empowering the others to do something about their health. So what should we be avoiding to say these conversations? Medical terms, I've mentioned this already couple of times before, trying to avoid medical terms. I mean, of course, you have to say genetic hemochromatosis. Okay, that is the only medical term I would say, because actually that's how the condition is called. But apart of that, trying to avoid all the medical terms, because otherwise it might create fear. And and avoiding again saying things like, you gave this to me. This is the most common statement I hear from children saying to their parents. So actually, they didn't give the genetic condition because you were born with two mutations, which means that was one from each parent. So you shouldn't be blaming a single individual parent for that. So we should be avoiding saying this and using this catastrophic language we should be avoiding. And that is one of the things nowadays, and perhaps because we are lacking to some extent on the resources for family members, and that is why we're going through this work with all of you, because we want to be we want you to share your thoughts with us, because unfortunately they go onto Facebook, okay, to go to social media. And I mean, we do moderate a support group on Facebook, but sometimes there are posts which are scary in its terminology. And for someone who's just been told that they have hemochromatosis, for example, might be difficult, might be overwhelming. And then let's say if someone hasn't even been diagnosed, just been told by a family member that they have hemochromatosis, and therefore they are suggesting for them to be tested. If they go online and start looking for these support groups, they will be scared in reading of some of the posts that are available. Of course, we try to moderate, but I think it's because of the lack of resources specifically for family. We don't want them to be doing their own research in terms of going into Facebook, for example. We want to have that pack available to them. So by the time they go onto social media, for example, they have all the information that they need before reading these sometimes unpleasant comments. And sorry, we don't want for them to be scared even before being tested. Okay, so we need to make sure that they feel confident in going ahead um, and getting themselves tested before seeing all these messages. And very important is trying to avoid forcing family to act immediately. I think we should be encouraging, don't pressure, because otherwise they may if they feel pressurized, is less likely, and this comes to the human behavior. If you feel pressurized, it's less likely you will engage with something, not just in these conversations, but in most things. So it's important that you encourage, give the resources that we will have available once we finish this project. Don't pressure, and then they can do with all the right resources, they can make their decision. It might not be the most wise decision. They might still refusing to be tested, for example, but that's their decision. So because we feel that might not be a wise decision, it doesn't necessarily mean that is not wise for them. So ultimately, they are adults, they have to decide by themselves, but we shouldn't be putting pressure for them to be tested, just giving that encouragement and supportive environment for them to consider genetic testing. A practical example is just, for example, just saying, I've recently been diagnosed with hemochromatosis, which is a common genetic condition. It's very treatable, but knowing if you carry the same gene or the same mutation can help prevent problems later. Would you like to know more about my diagnosis and overall hemochromatosis? And if you feel, and this is just a very quick script initial to prompt the conversation. And if they are interested, then you would carry on in explaining the condition, explaining the symptoms, how it is treated, because you want to start in the more factual, in a more supportive way. You don't feel that you have to tell them, but actually you are trying to create here the rapport from the other member of the family to start this conversation. And there are different genetic testing options for family members. So when they are talking about this condition and about the possibility for them to be tested, first of all, they can, I mean, in the case if it's a first degree family member, they should be going to their GP first of all to try to get the genetic test because they would meet the, let's say, eligibility criteria to be tested according to the guidelines. Now, if they are second degree relatives, GPs very likely will not be keen in doing genetic testing, even if there are red flags in terms of family members or even in terms of blood test results. And in that case, they can do private testing, and that includes from Haemochromatosis UK. The advantage through our genetic testing service is actually it's quite quick. Is just can be done at home. Normally we get the results within 1 to 2 weeks. So that's a very quick turnaround rather than 3, 6, 9 months in the NHS in some cases, from what we hear. And that includes a 45 minutes genetic counseling appointment with myself just to go through the results so they really understand the results for themselves and also the potential implications for their family members. And we do write all the results to their GPs because, I mean, if they are negative, they will not need to have any follow-up. But for example, if they are positive and if their results are high in terms of the iron levels, or if let's say if they haven't had the iron levels tested, that is going to be prompted by the GP. So that is why we inform GPs about the results, because they will be following up. They need to check the levels because it might be a case if they know that they are positive, then they need to keep an eye at least on the iron levels. And if so, let's say if they were to be raised, they will need to be referred to secondary care. And so that is why we do refer to the GP for follow-up. So when should relatives consider testing? And I have mentioned this on previous slides. It is recommended a first degree relative has genetic hemochromatosis, or let's say a relative with unexplained high ferritin or high TSAT, transferrin saturation level, or they might be presenting with symptoms such as fatigue, joint pain, abdominal pain, that are not explained by anything else. Okay. If there is no clear culprit or identified cause for these symptoms, then actually they should be considering genetic testing. Or if they are planning to form family, okay, and genetic hemochromatosis shouldn't stop people thinking about forming family in the future. But of course, they might need to know the carrier status, because then that is going to be putting into context whether or not their children or their future children might be at risk. So these are the main reasons why they should be considering testing. The benefits of early testing, which we need to be mentioning, is actually because I've been diagnosed, I'm telling you all this today, is because if you get now diagnosed, you're still young, and there is a high chance that you will never develop any organ damage. Okay, and it's just reframing to a more positive and supportive conversation. And just mentioning, even if you get diagnosed, let's say, by just monitoring and possibly the if I get the diagnosis, I can donate blood if my levels are not that high. So that's a good way of helping someone else, but also helping myself. So it's a win-win situation. And that already will unconsciously reduce anxiety through this clarity and transparent conversation. And mentioning as well that even if treatment is required, if it's needed, that venesection, which is bloodletting therapy, it's mostly well tolerated and very effective in lowering the levels. So just giving all this information to make them aware and to promote early testing rather than waiting another 10, 15 years, for example. Now, if they are worried, for example, which is a very common human reaction when you get told that potentially you might be affected by hemochromatosis, it's important to validate the feelings. Okay, normal, saying like it's normal to feel insecure, unsure about how to deal with this or whether or not we should be tested. Offer this neutral information, and it's just all the information I have given, all the examples so far that I have given, that this tends to be a neutral information, and encourage them to speak with ourselves, with myself, with Victoria, because we can if they don't feel empowered to tell their family members, we can at least, if they encourage them to speak with us, we will be introducing these conversations, and then the family member who initially started the conversation can pick up where we left the conversation and carry on with that conversation. And mentioning as well is trying to avoid diagnosing yourself, saying, well, I might have been diagnosed, but it does not necessarily mean that you have hemochromatosis. You might have some of the symptoms, but it doesn't really mean that you have hemochromatosis, because some of the symptoms, for example, that you are experiencing could be related or caused by something else, because some of these symptoms are subjective and do overlap with other health conditions. So that is why it's important to mention that don't diagnose yourself, not just because I was diagnosed, it doesn't mean you have it, but if you have, then that's fine. There is treatment, and just going back to the previous slide I mentioned. But yeah, we don't want people diagnosing themselves before actually getting the genetic test. So in a way, it's trying to relieve some of that worry. Now, when there are some more intrinsic family dynamics, which for some reason in the past they don't talk to each other, for example, and we have many cases of these families. It's important to start the conversation, and because they might be resist. I mean, they might resist testing. They might not be interested in listening. If you don't get, for example, we have had cases where brothers or sisters, they didn't talk each other. So actually trying to go through other family members to start the conversation with them normally is a strategy that tends to be highly effective. But also for ourselves, we have to understand the common reasons why they might be resisting testing. Might be because of denial, as I mentioned, might be because of fear of knowing if they actually have hemochromatosis, or misunderstanding, which is the most common one. By not understanding the condition, actually they just resist testing. Once they get in touch with us, actually after clarification, after having a long conversation with them, actually they're more keen in having the genetic testing. And that is why we want to give the resources to family members to be able to feel confident in having these conversations. And yeah, by sharing the factual information and non-emotional, trying to leave the emotions behind, just giving the factual information. and emphasizing that there is a choice of being tested or not, the potential risks of that in the future, but most importantly is by knowing earlier, just giving that empowerment for them to know early on, because all of the reasons that I have mentioned before. And again, avoid pressuring, because that is a very important thing that we do come across quite frequently, and we don't want to see that happening. So that is why I think creating this pack is going to be very useful, and creating a video which can be with these ideas, of course, can be empowering these family members who are having these conversations. And again, just offering these written information resources instead of repeating the conversation. You start the conversation, then you guide them by sending resources for them to actually do their own research in credible sources, and that would include Haemochromatosis UK website. So common questions families ask, family members ask: will I definitely get iron overload if they've been diagnosed with hemochromatosis? Can this affect my children? Is there a cure? Will insurance be affected? And before these questions are very commonly asked, you have to be prepared to be asked one of these questions, okay? So you have in your mind, you have already to prepare a short, evidence-based, in a friendly way of these answers, okay? Because it's more likely they will be asking these questions, and you need to be prepared to be asked these questions to be able to actually give an answer. I mean, for some reason, if you don't have the answer, you can direct to us, but the purpose of creating a pack is actually giving all this information that uh, they feel empowered to answer these questions appropriately. In terms of insurance, employment, and stigma that exists, trying to keep it simple, avoiding all the legal specifics, just mentioning that it's treatable, is very well manageable. Most people live normal lives. Employers, of course, they need to be informed how symptoms might impact their work, because might impact their productivity for a period of time whilst they're having treatment, for example. So they need to be on board, because, I mean, ideally, there should be some flexibility from the employer's point of view as well. And in terms of insurance, I mean, insurance consideration vary. It's important to check policies individually. But these are the things that you be mindful that you might need to mention when you're having these conversations. In terms of the impact on daily life, it's just mentioning, because they will be asking about this, is just again reassurance. Most people lead a full healthy life. Treatment helps alleviate some of the symptoms, and families who test early usually never develop significant complications. So it's just showing that actually you can still live pretty much normal life with hemochromatosis, with these strategies. And they will be asking very common question about nutrition, lifestyle. So what they should know. Basically, the general message you have to pass is no extreme diets, because ultimately you cannot manage hemochromatosis just by diet alone. So it's going to be important to have venesection treatment to try to manage your iron levels as they creep up again. But just mentioning balanced diets, that the heme iron is more absorbable than non-heme, and that is the iron that comes from animal origin. It's easily absorbed more than from plant-based food, for example. High dosages of vitamin C increasing the iron absorption, and alcohol, which we know increases the iron absorption, but also increases the risk of liver disease. Then in terms of family planning, which I slightly touched this on the previous slide, just saying that actually for your children to be affected, you and your wife, or you or your partner or your husband would actually need to be both carriers, for example, for any children to be affected with hemochromatosis. In that case, would be a 25% chance. If you are a carrier and if your partner is not affected, then actually the risk is very small. They will not develop. Your children will not develop hemochromatosis. They might be carriers, but they will not develop hemochromatosis. Offering this factual advice in terms of the autosomal recessive pathway, in terms of the genetics, offering a calm conversation, and encouraging seeking genetic counseling if needed, and they can come to us, they can contact us for that if they aren't sure about the genetic pattern in terms of inheritance pattern and the potential risk for forming family for the children potentially. A very important one is when you're having these conversations, you need to be mindful of cultural and generational differences, and different cultures will have different approaches to conversations around genetics. Okay, I've just given an example here specifically about Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, for example, but there are many other cultures and practices that you need to be mindful when you're having these conversations. For example, fear of stigma affecting marriage prospects. For example, if you have hemochromatosis, they might be asking if the other half actually is a carrier or has hemochromatosis, for example. There is this concern that that families might be blamed for passing on genetic conditions. So this unfortunately does exist in some cultures. There is culture preference to keep health matters within the immediate household and not disseminating that information to, let's say, second-degree family members. So it just stays with the immediate household, and therefore, if you are in one of these communities, cultures, for example, then actually you need to know, or you need to prepare them to be talking about hemochromatosis, about this genetic condition with other with second-degree family members, because actually there is a risk for them to develop. And I'm thinking more, I mean, for example, type 4 hemochromatosis, it's more common in some communities, for example, Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi. Okay, so therefore it's important to have these conversations, and they need to feel empowered to have these conversations. I mean, within this community, it's very rare for them to have type 1, but I'm thinking more about type 4. So some groups emphasize the fate. They just believe, well, if it's written down to happen, it's going to happen, making genetic discussions sometimes and not necessary to have, or feeling intrusive to have these kind of conversations. All the relatives might dismiss the symptoms or even the genetic ideas, and they might just say, well, all the symptoms are just because I'm getting old. It's nothing to do with my genetics, even though you might have a first-degree family member with hemochromatosis. So most importantly, in any of these conversations, is having this more sensible approach, being patient when you having these conversations. And basically, in a nutshell, the key takeaways is just passing this that is common, well managed, treatable. Family communication is essential. Testing empowers relatives in terms of maintaining their health, offering clear, calm conversation. We know that reduces fear and anxiety. And above everything, we are here to support in every step.
What would be very helpful, would have been for my family, is either leaflets online that I can just email or send by text, WhatsApp leaflets, just basically maybe drawing with what it is, what it's about, because they're more likely look at that and ignore me and then come back to me. I think that would help, because I've got to say, And then, of course, we've got to get into father's. If it's my mother's family, we've got to get into father's family. And if it's my father's family, then they start talking about my mother's family. So each family gets blamed, and it's both parents. So then they start going into DNA and genetics. So if there was just like a leaflet, you could just send on WhatsApp or something like that, just little snippets, and then you can ignore the family and they can look at it themselves. Then they come back.
I think that's a very good suggestion, making it easily shareable like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Because
Thank
then
you.
I don't have to speak to them really, and if I don't want to, and they don't have to speak to me, they can ingest it, and because they
Yeah.
have done and come back. Yeah.
And that is
Okay.
the main
Thank
idea,
you.
Lisa. Yeah, that's the main idea. Because if you have different, because I mean, everyone just have a different kind of absorbing information. Okay, it's like the learning styles. All of us have different learning styles. So the idea is having different resources to adapt to different individuals. And some individuals might prefer the leaflets. Some individuals might prefer short videos with all these bits of information. So, and just having that choice of different resources, and then of course, you can share via WhatsApp or even social media or just going to the
Just
website.
like little cards on WhatsApp, because everybody seems to, well, my family write to each other on WhatsApp a lot. My age group are slightly older than I'm the youngest in the family. And the older ones, like my mother's age, 90, 89, they'll talk to you, then they'll go rattle the family. But the thing is, in a family, you have to find the members of the family. There's one in each family that will go gossiping to all the rest. When maybe there's 5 in a family, like we have at times, one of them will go rounding them all up and telling them, and
That's
the other
lovely,
one won't
Lisa.
round
Yeah,
anybody up or tell anybody.
that's a lovely suggestion. I think that's really helpful. I think Janet, you would
Yeah.
like. Thank you, Lisa. Ed, please, would you like to have a go while Janet?
Okay, well, while she tries to sort it out. Hello, everyone. I think it's within your vision about how the video and the contents of the pack will be put together. So forgive me if I'm suggesting something that's already in mind. But I think because of the way that the conversation can unfold with someone who's been recently diagnosed, one angle is that that person could kind of explain this is probably the reason why I've been exhibiting symptom X, Y, and Z. So why I've been so tired, why I've been so impatient, why I've been complaining about joint pain, why I haven't been thinking clearly or unable to make decisions, indecisive. And those situations could have changed over time and become more serious. And it's a way of introducing the fact that this has had an effect upon the patient who's been recently diagnosed and helping the others to understand that it hasn't just been a grumpy old so and so or, tired and just lazy because, they can't get up and have the energy to do the decorating and this kind of thing. I think that might be quite an important way in to actually build an understanding and an empathy between the family members about what someone has been going through. So keeping it factual is important. But I think the emotional impact of sharing that kind of family information is also quite powerful in helping people to understand the impact that it can have. And it opens their eyes, I think, to the fact that, yeah, it could be really important that the rest of us get some testing or look into this a bit further so that we can avoid following the journey, at quite such a severe experience, treat it early, avoid it altogether, or at least find some relief in knowing that you're not going to develop any symptoms later in life.
Thank you, Ed. Definitely a very good suggestion because by sharing, if they share their own experience, then actually the other family members will understand better why they were feeling in such a way. So yeah, that's a very good way of approaching and just starting the conversation. They might be more recipient to receive that information. Yeah, definitely something
I think
to be included.
yeah, I think we just even heard it in how you said it, Edward. It was a nice human way of putting it across. So brilliant. Amanda, would you like to say something? You're on mute at the moment.
Yes, I was just going to say, I think this is really useful, and I don't know if it's in the remit, sorry, of the buddy, but if perhaps the buddy can, because I don't know if most people immediately latched onto a body when they were diagnosed, what I did. And then, of course, the first thing you want to do is to tell your family. So perhaps the body can point indirectly, even if it's not in their remit to make suggestions, but to point you in the direction of a pack, because I can see that I probably made a few errors banging on to my family, because three of my sisters have got children, and I just thought, oh, they need to know. So I probably, approached it maybe in the wrong way.
No, I think it's very fair, and at the moment we don't really have something that easily gets that across. And I think getting that in through bodies is great. I see Janet as IT support.
Because it is the first, well, for me, it was the first thing I wanted to do, was to let people know. Because it was
which is a brilliant response. I think that's the response we like to see. But Janet, have you managed to get sound? Thank you very much, Amanda. Did you have anything else?
No, that's fine. Apart from, I obviously wasn't very effective, because 2 years later, my mother said, well, I haven't got it.
Can you hear?
Yes, that's great. Diogo,
so that's a very good question. So, I mean, all the information I have provided would answer that, because, I mean, it's still important for your children, grown-up children, to know whether or not they're at risk. And let's say, for example, if one of your children was diagnosed and they mentioned to you that they've been diagnosed and would be important for you and your husband to be tested, for example, you would get tested. And then if it turns out that you are a carrier, for example, that will be important to approach your husband and say, well, our daughter or our son has been diagnosed for this genetic condition. I'm a carrier. You must be at least a carrier. So it would be important to know whether or not you're just a carrier, or we know that there is a possibility you could actually have hemochromatosis, and you could have iron overload, because these are levels. The iron levels are something that normally don't get tested on a regular basis. Is not part of the annual monitoring that most GPs will be asking. And therefore, even if you are old, it doesn't really matter. It's never too late to get the diagnosis of genetic hemochromatosis. Okay, we still have some individuals in their 80s who are being treated, who are on venesection. So, because ultimately, even if you are in the older age, it's important to get the levels down, because that could limit your life expectancy, and also, more importantly, it could impact your quality of life if you got the diagnosis and if you got treated. So that is why it's important to try, in a way, not convince, because ultimately your husband, for example, will be the individuals taking that decision whether or not to be tested, but just giving that context is very important. So that would be the way we should be approaching in this specific case.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very clear.